She stood at the altar trembling, 19 years old and sold to a beast of a man to settle her father's staggering debts. Caleb Montgomery was scarred, silent, and utterly terrifying. She expected a life of brutal captivity in the high wilderness, but on their wedding night, his unexpected gift changed everything. The winter of 1878 hit the Colorado Territory with a viciousness that froze the Animas River solid by mid-November. But the chill in the air was nothing compared to the ice running through Abigail Preston's veins. At 19, Abigail was the jewel of Denver's emerging high society. A girl raised on imported silk, finishing school etiquette, and the promise of a brilliant marriage. Her father, Thomas Preston, was a railroad tycoon whose wealth seemed as immovable as the Rockies themselves. But wealth in the West was a fragile illusion, built on paper promises and silver veins that could pinch out without warning. The collapse began not with a roar, but with a whisper behind the closed mahogany doors of the First National Bank of Denver. Thomas had over-leveraged his assets, pouring everything into the blind promise of the San Juan mining syndicate. When the veins came up dry, the syndicate collapsed. Thomas wasn't just bankrupt. He owed $70,000, a staggering fortune, to a consortium of ruthless creditors led by Nathaniel Reed, a slick, East Coast speculator who had long looked at Abigail with hungry, calculating eyes. Nathaniel made his terms clear. He would forgive the debt and save Thomas from a federal penitentiary, provided Abigail became his wife. It was a trap perfectly laid. Nathaniel didn't love her. He wanted a trophy, a beautiful, broken aristocrat to parade on his arm. The night before the papers were to be signed, Thomas Preston sat in his study, a loaded Colt revolver on his desk, weeping into his hands. Abigail stood in the doorway, her heart shattering, prepared to sacrifice her life to Nathaniel to save her father's life. Then, the heavy oak doors of the Preston mansion shuddered under a massive fist. Enter Caleb Montgomery. Historical records from the La Plata County Archives describe Caleb as a man who belonged to a forgotten era. Standing 6'4", draped in heavy elk hide and smelling of wood smoke, pine, and leather, he was a mountain man who made his fortune trapping and timbering in the unforgiving peaks of the Needles Range. His face was a rugged landscape of sun-weathered skin, dominated by a jagged, pale scar that slashed down the left side of his jaw, a souvenir from a grizzly bear that had not survived their encounter. His eyes, however, were the color of glacial ice, pale, piercing, and terrifyingly calm. He did not wait for the butler. Caleb strode into the study, his heavy boots tracking snow onto the Persian rugs. Without a word of greeting, he threw a thick stack of legal documents onto the desk, right over the revolver. "I bought your paper, Preston." Caleb's voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder echoing through a canyon. "Every cent you owe to Reed and the bank. I own the deed to this house, the remaining shares of your rail line, and your freedom." Thomas stared, trembling. "Why? What do you want?" Caleb's icy gaze shifted slowly to the doorway, pinning Abigail to the spot. "I want her." Abigail stopped breathing. The room spun. This man was a savage, a ghost story the city folk whispered about when discussing the wild men who lived above the snow line. He was twice her size, scarred, and rumored to be violently antisocial. "You can't," Thomas choked out. "She is my daughter. She is promised to Nathaniel Reed." "Reed is a snake who will sell her to the highest bidder the moment he tires of her," Caleb stated flatly. "My terms are simple. She marries me tomorrow at noon. She comes back to my claim in the San Juans. In exchange, the debt is marked paid in full, and you get to keep this house. Refuse, and I foreclose by nightfall." Abigail looked at her father, broken and weeping, and then at the massive, terrifying stranger who now owned her life. The frontier was an unforgiving place for women, and tales of men dragging brides into the wilderness to serve as isolated, abused laborers were horrifyingly common. She was terrified of him. She feared his size, his silence, and the brutal world he came from. But as she looked into Caleb's eyes, she saw an unyielding wall of stone. There was no lust in his gaze, no cruel amusement, only a hard, absolute finality. "I will do it," Abigail whispered, stepping into the room, her voice trembling but her chin raised. "I will marry you, Mr. Montgomery." Caleb didn't smile. He simply nodded, touched the brim of his snow-crusted hat, and said, "Pack warm, Miss Preston. We leave immediately after the vows." The wedding was a brief, sterile affair in the back room of Judge Samuel Patterson's office. There were no flowers, no white gown, and no music. Abigail wore her heaviest wool traveling dress, her hands shaking so violently she could barely hold the pen to sign the marriage certificate. Caleb stood beside her, a towering monument of silence, smelling of cold air and saddle leather. When the judge pronounced them man and wife, Caleb did not lean in to kiss her. He simply turned, picked up her single canvas trunk, and walked out the door. The journey out of Denver and into the deep mountains was a grueling descent into a frozen purgatory. They traveled by train to the end of the line in Alamosa, and from there, Caleb had arranged a heavily packed mule train. For 4 days, they ascended into the treacherous, snow-choked passes of the San Juan Mountains. Abigail spent every waking hour in a state of suffocating terror. She rode behind him, staring at the broad, muscular span of his back, waiting for the moment his brutality would show itself. She expected him to demand her submission, to force himself upon her in the freezing canvas tents they slept in at night. But the cruelty never came. Instead, Caleb operated with a strange, mechanical care. When the temperatures plummeted below zero, he gave her his heavy buffalo hide coat, riding in only his wool jacket despite the biting wind. At night, he set up her cot near the cast iron camp stove, boiling water for her tea, before retreating to the far side of the tent to sleep on the hard, frozen ground. He barely spoke to her, answering her timid questions with single grunts or short, clipped sentences. His silence was deafening, and in her fear-addled mind, Abigail interpreted it as a simmering rage. She was a burden to him, a fragile city girl who didn't know how to saddle a horse or build a fire. She was sure he was just waiting until they were completely isolated to break her. On the 5th day, the mountain showed its true teeth. They were crossing a narrow, wind-scoured ridge known as the Devil's Shelf. To their left was a sheer rock wall. To their right, a drop of 1,000 feet into a jagged ravine. Without warning, a whiteout blizzard slammed into the ridge. The wind howled like a wounded animal, instantly blinding them in a vortex of driving snow. The temperature dropped so fast, Abigail felt her lungs burning with every breath. Her mule, panicked by the sudden storm and the slick ice beneath its hooves, bucked violently. Abigail screamed as the saddle slipped. She was thrown backward, sliding over the edge of the trail. She caught a desperate handful of frozen roots, dangling over the abyss. The wind tore at her clothes, trying to pull her down into the gray void. She squeezed her eyes shut, sobbing, waiting for her fingers to give out. She thought of her father. She thought of the warm fire in her Denver parlor. She prepared to die. Suddenly, a massive hand locked around her wrist like a vise of iron. Caleb had thrown himself belly down on the ice. His face was inches from hers, the scar on his jaw stark white against the cold. For the first time, his pale eyes weren't calm. They were blazing with a fierce, primal intensity. "Look at me!" he roared over the shrieking wind. "Abigail, look at me!" She opened her eyes, terrified. "I've got you," he shouted, his voice cutting through the storm like an anchor. "I am not going to let you fall. Do you hear me? I will not let you fall." With a guttural roar of exertion, Caleb hoisted her upward, dragging her over the ice and snow with sheer brute strength. He pulled her onto the safety of the trail, wrapping his massive arms around her as she collapsed into his chest, sobbing uncontrollably. For a moment, amidst the raging blizzard, he didn't pull away. He held her tight against his chest, shielding her from the wind with his own body. She could hear his heart pounding wildly beneath his thick coat. "You're safe," he murmured into her hair, his voice rough and breathless. "You're safe." They rode double on his horse for the rest of the day, leaving the panicked mule behind. Abigail clung to his waist, her face buried in the warm leather of his coat. For the first time since he had smashed through the doors of her father's study, Abigail felt something besides fear. She felt a strange, confusing spark of awe. This man was a beast. Yes. but he was a beast that protected what was his. They reached Caleb's claim 2 days later, just as the sun was bleeding a bruised purple across the jagged peaks. Abigail had expected a squalid, drafty shack, but what she saw made her gasp. Nestled in a sheltered basin surrounded by towering ponderosa pines, sat a magnificent, sprawling log cabin. It was a masterpiece of timber craftsmanship, built with precision and care. Stone chimneys pushed thick, welcoming gray smoke into the sky. The windows were solid glass, not oiled paper, and a massive wraparound porch overlooked a frozen alpine lake. It was not a trapper's hovel. It was a fortress, built by a man who intended to stay forever. Caleb dismounted and lifted her down from the horse. His hands lingered on her waist for a fraction of a second, longer than necessary, before he stepped back, his face returning to its usual stoic mask. "Welcome to Timberline," he said quietly. Inside, the cabin was warm and impeccably clean. Navajo rugs covered the polished wood floors, and shelves lined with leather-bound books occupied the walls. It was the home of a reader, a thinker, not an illiterate savage. But the warmth of the cabin could not thaw the ice forming in Abigail's stomach. It was their first night under a real roof. It was their wedding night. She stood in the center of the great room, her hands folded tightly in front of her, trembling as Caleb locked the heavy front door and stoked the fire. He turned to her, the firelight casting long, dancing shadows across his scarred face. The sheer size of him in the enclosed space was overwhelming. "There is hot water in the copper tub in the back room," Caleb said, not meeting her eyes. "You should bathe and get warm. I will tend to the horses." He left her alone for over an hour. Abigail washed the grime and terror of the journey from her skin, her mind racing. When she emerged in her heavy linen nightgown, clutching a shawl around her shoulders, Caleb was sitting in a leather armchair by the fire. On the low table between them rested a small, beautifully carved wooden box. He looked up at her, and for the first time, she saw a profound exhaustion in his eyes. He didn't look at her like a piece of property. He looked at her with a heavy, solemn respect. "Sit down, Abigail," he said softly. She took a seat on the edge of the sofa, her knees pressed tightly together. "What is going to happen now?" she whispered, unable to keep the fear out of her voice. Caleb leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I know you are terrified of me. I know you think I bought you like a prized mare to warm my bed and scrub my floors." Abigail looked down at her hands, unable to deny it. "Open the box," he commanded gently. With trembling fingers, Abigail reached forward and undid the brass latch. Inside rested a stack of papers, bound in twine, and a thick velvet pouch. She pulled the papers out and held them to the firelight. Her breath hitched. The first document was a deed. But it wasn't the deed to her father's house. It was the deed to the Timberline property, the massive cabin and the surrounding 400 acres of prime timberland. The name on the deed, freshly registered with the territory, read, Abigail Preston Montgomery. "Turn to the next page," Caleb said, his voice hard now. She did. It was a ledger, along with several handwritten letters. The handwriting belonged to Nathaniel Reed. As Abigail's eyes scanned the words, a cold horror washed over her. It was a detailed correspondence between Nathaniel and the mining syndicate foreman. Nathaniel hadn't just capitalized on her father's failure. He had engineered it. He had bribed the surveyors to falsify reports, tricking Thomas Preston into investing his entire fortune into a dead mine. Worse were the letters addressed to a man in San Francisco. Nathaniel was discussing a debt settlement involving Abigail. He had no intention of marrying her. He was planning to ship her west to pay off his own gambling debts to a notoriously brutal underworld boss. The papers fluttered from her numb fingers, scattering across the rug. "Nathaniel Reed destroyed your father on purpose," Caleb said, his voice low and dangerous. "He orchestrated the bankruptcy to trap you. I found out a month ago when one of his couriers got drunk in a Durango saloon and started bragging about the pretty little aristocrat Reed was going to sell down the river." Abigail stared at Caleb, her mind reeling. "But why did you step in? You paid $70,000. You gave up a fortune to buy the debt." Caleb finally looked away, staring into the roaring fire. The flames illuminated the jagged scar on his face, But right then, he didn't look like a monster at all. He looked like a solitary, honorable guardian. 3 years ago, when the cholera swept through the lower camps, the banks cut off all credit for medicine, Caleb said quietly. Your father was the only man in Denver who sent a train car full of quinine and blankets down the line, no charge. He saved a lot of good people. He saved people who worked for me. Caleb turned his piercing eyes back to her. I pay my debts, Abigail. Your father was a good man who got cornered by a snake. I couldn't let Reed destroy his family. But you married me, she stammered, tears welling in her eyes. You dragged me up here. Caleb reached forward and nudged the velvet pouch inside the box. If I had just paid the debt and left you in Denver, Reed would have found another way. He owned the local judge. He would have had your father arrested on trumped-up fraud charges and taken you anyway. The only way to put you completely out of his legal reach was to make you the wife of a man he couldn't intimidate, in a territory he couldn't control. Abigail reached into the box and opened the velvet pouch. A heavy stack of $20 gold double eagles spilled out thousands of dollars. That is $10,000, Caleb said. Half my liquid savings. The deed to this land is in your name. You own it all. You are a wealthy, independent woman, Abigail. He stood up, his massive frame towering over the fire. I didn't bring you here to be a prisoner. I brought you here to hide you until the spring thaw. By then, the federal marshals I hired will have finished investigating the evidence in those letters, and Nathaniel Reed will be in a federal penitentiary. When the snow melts, you can take the gold, go back to Denver or San Francisco or anywhere you want. We can annul the marriage. You are free. Abigail sat paralyzed, the gold coins heavy in her lap, the fire crackling in the silence. She had spent the last 2 weeks fearing the beast who had bought her. Now, she realized the beast had actually slayed the dragon to set her free. And until the spring? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Caleb walked to the door of the bedroom, his hand resting on the frame. He didn't look back until the spring. Miss Preston, this cabin is yours. I will sleep in the bunkhouse by the stables. You have nothing to fear from me. Good night. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind him, leaving Abigail alone in the warmth of the fire, staring at the unimaginable wedding gift that had just shattered her entire world. The winter of 1878 dragged its icy claws across the San Juans, sealing timberline in a fortress of impenetrable white. True to his word, Caleb Montgomery banished himself to the drafty, uninsulated bunkhouse by the stables. For the first few weeks, Abigail saw him only in passing. He would chop cords of wood with relentless, rhythmic strikes before dawn, leave a freshly hunted elk or brace of rabbits on the porch, and disappear into the tree line to check his trap lines. Inside the massive cabin, Abigail found herself drowning in the silence. She had expected to feel relief at his distance, to revel in the safety he had so surprisingly provided. Instead, she felt a gnawing guilt. She slept in a feather bed by a roaring hearth, while the man who had sacrificed half his fortune to save her froze in a wooden shack. By late January, the temperatures plummeted to 30 below zero. The timber of the cabin groaned and cracked under the sheer weight of the cold. That night, Abigail wrapped herself in Caleb's heavy buffalo coat, carried a lantern through the howling wind, and unlatched the bunkhouse door. She found him sitting on a thin wool blanket, his breath pluming in the freezing air, meticulously cleaning a Winchester repeating rifle by the dim light of a kerosene lamp. He looked up, his pale eyes registering a flash of surprise. The fire in the great room is large enough for two, Mr. Montgomery, Abigail said, her teeth chattering despite the heavy coat. I will not have you freeze to death on my property. A slow, barely perceptible shift occurred in Caleb's rugged face. He didn't argue. He packed up his rifle, blew out the lamp, and followed her inside. That night changed the rhythm of their survival. Caleb moved into the spare room down the hall. They fell into a quiet, domestic dance. In the evenings, they sat by the fire. Abigail read aloud from his extensive library Shakespeare, Whitman, and the journals of Lewis and Clark. She learned that Caleb was not merely a trapper. He was a self-educated philosopher of the woods, a man who had chosen the mountains not to escape civilization, but because he found the society of Denver painfully hollow. In return, Caleb taught her the brutal arithmetic of frontier survival. He taught her how to dress a wound, how to predict a squall by the color of the clouds over the needles, and, most importantly, how to shoot. He placed the heavy Winchester in her hands, his massive, calloused fingers gently guiding her grip. Standing behind her on the snow-packed porch, his chest brushing her back, he showed her how to align the iron sights. In those fleeting moments of proximity, Abigail felt a treacherous, fluttering heat in her stomach. The fear she once held for his size had completely evaporated, replaced by an undeniable magnetic pull toward his quiet strength. She began to realize that the scar on his face was not a mark of a monster, but the badge of a survivor. And she found herself staring at the rugged line of his jaw when he wasn't looking, wondering what those rough lips would feel like. But the sanctuary of Timberline was built on borrowed time. Nathaniel Reed was not a man who accepted defeat, nor was he a man who waited for spring. When his spies in Durango informed him that the federal marshals were beginning to sniff around his syndicate ledgers, Reed panicked. He knew Abigail was the key. If she lived to testify, he would hang. In mid-February, under the cover of a blinding squall, trouble arrived at Timberline. Abigail was reading by the fire, while Caleb sharpened a hunting knife. Suddenly, Caleb froze. The steel went still against the whetstone. He tilted his head, his pale eyes darting toward the frosted glass of the front window. "Get down," he whispered, his voice dangerously calm. "Caleb, what?" "Floor. Now." The window exploded inward in a shower of deadly glass shards just as Abigail threw herself onto the Navajo rug. The deafening roar of a scattergun echoed through the basin, tearing a hole the size of a melon through the back of Caleb's leather armchair. Caleb was moving before the glass even hit the floorboards. He kicked over the heavy oak dining table, yanking Abigail behind it just as a second volley of gunfire splintered the front door. "3 shooters," Caleb grunted, sweeping the Winchester off the mantel. He tossed a heavy Colt revolver into Abigail's lap. "Check the cylinder, just like I taught you." Abigail's hand shook, but she pulled the hammer back, the metallic click grounding her panic. "Who are they?" "Bounty men. Pinkerton rejects. Reed must have paid them a fortune to brave the pass in this weather." Caleb peeked over the edge of the overturned table, the firelight catching the cold, murderous fury in his eyes. "They aren't here to take you back, Abigail. They're here to bury us both." The front door buckled under a heavy boot, the iron hinges screaming. Caleb didn't hesitate. He swung the Winchester around and fired twice through the thick oak. A muffled scream echoed from the porch, followed by the heavy thud of a body hitting the snow. "One down," Caleb growled. Suddenly, the back door leading to the kitchen was kicked open. 2 men wearing heavy dusters and face masks swarmed into the cabin, revolvers drawn. Caleb spun to fire, but one of the men was faster. A gunshot cracked like a whip, and Caleb was thrown backward against the stone hearth with a sickening grunt, blood instantly blooming across the left shoulder of his wool shirt. The rifle clattered out of his hands. The larger of the 2 intruders racked the hammer of his gun, stepping toward Caleb's bleeding form with a cruel laugh. "Reed sends his regards, mountain man." He never saw Abigail rise from behind the oak table. She didn't scream. She didn't close her eyes. She gripped the heavy Colt exactly as Caleb had taught her, leveled the sights at the center of the intruder's chest, and pulled the trigger. The roar of the gun in the enclosed space was deafening. The impact threw the man backward into the kitchen doorframe, his gun firing uselessly into the ceiling as he collapsed. The second intruder spun toward her, raising his weapon, but Caleb, roaring like the grizzly that had scarred him, lunged from the floor. He tackled the remaining man through the shattered front window, sending them both tumbling out into the freezing snow. Abigail scrambled over the debris, rushing to the jagged window frame. Out in the snowbank, a brutal, desperate struggle was taking place. The intruder had a knife, slashing wildly, but Caleb's sheer primal strength was overwhelming. With a final, sickening crunch, Caleb disarmed the man and knocked him unconscious against the porch pilings. Silence slammed back into the basin, save for the howling wind and the crackle of the fire. Caleb staggered to his feet, clutching his profusely bleeding shoulder, his breath coming in ragged, bloody gasps. He looked up at the shattered window, his eyes locking onto Abigail. She was still holding the smoking revolver, her face pale, her chest heaving. He stumbled toward the porch, collapsing onto the wooden steps. Abigail dropped the gun and ran out into the freezing night. "I've got you," she sobbed, grabbing his good arm and hauling his massive weight over her shoulder, echoing the very words he had spoken to her on the cliffside. "I will not let you fall." The ensuing 48 hours were a grueling, blood-soaked descent into a different kind of survival. The howling blizzard outside was nothing compared to the terrifying battle being waged inside the master bedroom of the cabin. Abigail managed to drag Caleb's massive, unresponsive frame onto the heavy quilt of the bed. The bullet had torn clean through the thick musculature of his upper shoulder, mercifully missing the collarbone, but the blood loss was catastrophic. His skin, usually flush with the ruddy color of wind and sun, had turned a terrifying ashen gray. Driven by a primal, desperate adrenaline she didn't know she possessed, Abigail tore her linen petticoats into strips. She boiled water over the roaring hearth, packing the jagged entrance and exit wounds with dried yarrow she found in his apothecary jars, pressing down with all her weight to staunch the bleeding. For 2 days and 2 nights, Caleb drifted in and out of a violent, agonizing fever. Abigail never left his side. She slept in snatches, slumped in a hard wooden chair, waking every hour to bathe his sweating forehead with a cold cloth or carefully spoon bone broth between his cracked, dry lips. The cabin, once a fortress of quiet, was filled with his strained breathing and the terrifying specter of gangrene. It was during the darkest, coldest hour of the second night, while the wind hammered relentlessly against the thick timber walls, that the silent mountain man finally confessed his hidden truth to the shadows of the room. "Didn't do it. For the old man," Caleb mumbled, his head tossing restlessly on the feather pillow. His massive, calloused hand shot out, blindly gripping Abigail's wrist with shocking strength. Did it for her. Abigail froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. She leaned over him, her face inches from his. "Caleb, I'm here. Can you hear me?" He didn't wake, but his pale eyes darted frantically beneath his eyelids. Trapped in a fever dream. Saw her. Outside the Tremont house. "Last year," he whispered, his voice a raspy, broken gravel. "Rich girl. Silk dress. Blue silk." But she knelt right down in the freezing mud. Gave her own woven shawl to a crippled silver miner. Ruined the dress. She didn't care. I saw her. Knew right then. She had a mountain heart. Abigail's breath hitched in her throat. She remembered that day. She remembered the freezing rain, the shivering old man with the ruined leg, and the scolding her father had given her for ruining a dress imported from Paris. "Too good for those city vultures," Caleb choked out, his grip tightening on her wrist. "Couldn't let Reed have her. Had to step in. Had to save her. Even if she hates me." Tears spilled hot and fast down Abigail's cheeks, dropping onto the heavy quilt. He hadn't bought her out of a stoic sense of duty to her father's past charity. He had bought her because he had seen her true spirit when she thought no one in the world was paying attention. He had loved her silently, fiercely, from a distance, without any hope of ever truly claiming her for over a year. He had planned to bankrupt himself just to set her free. By the dawn of the 4th day, the fever finally broke. Caleb awoke to the smell of pine and the sight of Abigail asleep in the chair beside his bed, her hand still tightly clutching his rough fingers. He looked at her, his pale, glacial eyes finally clear, and gently squeezed her hand. The emotional barricade that had stood between them since Denver shattered completely. In the weeks that followed, as Caleb slowly healed, the air in the cabin hummed with a thick, undeniable tension. They no longer avoided each other's gaze. When his broad shoulder brushed against hers in the narrow kitchen, he didn't pull away, and neither did she. One evening in late April, while the fire popped and hissed, she was replacing the bandages on his shoulder. His skin was warm beneath her fingertips, the wound knitting together cleanly. Without warning, Caleb's massive hand reached up, his rough, calloused fingers gently cupping her jaw. "You saved my life, Abigail," he murmured, his thumb tracing the soft line of her cheek. "You saved mine first," she whispered back, leaning into his touch. He leaned in, and for the first time since their sterile, terrifying wedding day, their lips met. It wasn't a tentative, careful kiss. It was a hungry, desperate collision of two souls who had fought a war and bled in the snow to find each other. Caleb pulled her firmly into his lap, burying his face in her hair, breathing her in as if she were the only oxygen left on earth. Abigail wrapped her arms tightly around his neck, kissing the jagged, terrifying scar on his face, claiming every part of the beast who had turned out to be the best, most honorable man she had ever known. When the deep snows finally began to rot in late May, turning the alpine slopes into a vibrant, blinding explosion of green grass and columbines, the outside world finally breached the isolated basin. A posse of 6 armed riders crested the ridge. Caleb and Abigail stood on the porch, Caleb holding the Winchester firmly at his side, his body tense, but the lead rider raised an empty hand in peace, sunlight flashing off the silver star pinned to his leather vest. It was Dave Cook, the legendary head of the Rocky Mountain Detective Association, acting on federal authority. "Put the rifle away, Montgomery," Cook called out, dismounting his exhausted horse. "I bring good news from the valley." General Cook sat at the rebuilt dining table, gratefully accepting a cup of black coffee. He laid out the aftermath of the brutal winter. The syndicate ledgers Caleb had provided were highly explosive. Governor Frederick Pitkin himself had authorized the federal warrants. Nathaniel Reed's criminal empire had completely unraveled under the weight of the evidence. When marshals raided his Denver offices, Reed had attempted to flee to California, but he was apprehended at the train station. He was currently sitting in the Territorial Penitentiary in Cannon City, facing 20 years for fraud, extortion, and conspiracy to commit murder. "Your father's name is entirely cleared, Mrs. Montgomery," Cook said, tipping his hat respectfully to Abigail. "The bank has reinstated his rail lines and returned his assets. He is a free, prosperous man again." Cook cleared his throat, looking awkwardly between the two of them. "The governor also sent word regarding your unique marital situation. Given the extreme duress under which the union was formed, a federal judge in Durango is prepared to sign an immediate annulment. You are completely free to return to Denver with us, ma'am, Mr. Montgomery has already drafted a bank draft, giving you the $10,000 in gold, just as he originally promised in his letters to the court." Caleb stood rigidly by the fireplace, staring into the cold, dead ashes. His face was an unreadable, terrifying mask of stone. He had packed her canvas trunk before dawn. He was keeping his word. He was letting her go back to the world she belonged to. "Thank you, General Cook," Abigail said quietly, her voice perfectly steady. "Could you give us a moment?" "Of course, ma'am. I'll wait by the horses." Cook stepped out onto the porch, shutting the heavy door behind him. Abigail turned to Caleb. He absolutely refused to look at her. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, filling the massive cabin. "Your trunk is by the door," Caleb finally said, his voice completely devoid of emotion, tight with the effort of holding himself back. "The bank draft for the gold is on the table next to the annulment papers. The pass is clear. You can be back in your father's mansion, sleeping on silk, by next week." Abigail walked slowly across the wide plank floorboards, stopping mere inches from his broad chest. "Is that truly what you want, Caleb? You want me to go back to the city?" Caleb's jaw clenched. The muscles in his thick neck strained as he fought a losing battle to keep his composure. "I promised you your freedom, Abigail. I am a man of my word. You were born for society and comfort, not chopping firewood and surviving gunfights in the snow. You have your entire life back." "You stubborn idiot," she whispered, her voice trembling with fiercely contained emotion. Caleb finally looked down at her, his pale eyes wide and startled. Abigail reached over to the dining table. She picked up the heavy bank draft for $10,000 and deliberately tore it right down the middle, dropping the pieces onto the floorboards. Next, she picked up the unsigned annulment papers, walked to the hearth, and tossed them straight into the smoldering embers of the morning fire. "I don't want the gold, and I certainly don't want Denver," Abigail said, stepping directly into his space, her eyes blazing with a fierce, unbreakable light. I want the man who stood between me and the edge of a cliff. I want the man who took a bullet for me. I want my husband. Caleb's stoic, unyielding mask finally fractured. The iron wall he had built around his heart completely shattered. With a ragged, breathless exhale that sounded almost like a sob, he reached out and hauled her against his chest, lifting her clean off her feet. He kissed her with a staggering, consuming passion, his rough hands tangling in her hair, holding her tight against him as if he would rather face 100 bitter winters than ever let her go. "Timberline is my home," she murmured against his lips, tears of absolute joy streaming down her face. "And so are you." Abigail and Caleb Montgomery never returned to Denver society. Instead, they built Timberline into the most prosperous, fiercely independent timber empire in the Colorado Territory, their love forged in the fires of a brutal winter and bound by an unbreakable loyalty. If you love this story of resilience, frontier justice, and unexpected romance, hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling tales from the Wild West.